Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I have great sympathy with the interests and the approach that many of you are associated with through this trust. And I think it's, we obviously live in what are very challenging times for those who are concerned about family structures. I'm going to be talking obviously about these issues today. I suppose that I ought to get the bad news over at the beginning, which is to say I think it's going to get a lot worse. At least from the perspective that I suspect many of you share with me, it's going to get a lot worse. But let me try and say a little bit about where the grounds for hope may be located nonetheless. Now, I want to really begin by reminding you, and I'm sure you really don't need to be reminded of this, of some of the things that the Family Education Trust really says about itself and how it characterizes or has characterized its own activities and purposes. It distinguishes itself from various other groups with whom it might share some interests and values by not really being a sort of campaigning group around a single issue. It's concerned with, as it were, a broad framework, and it's also concerned with, as it were, going deep to look at what underlies certain trends, certain patterns of behavior and policies and so on, as those bear upon the family quite broadly. And I think that's a very prudent and wise way to proceed, because one can easily get caught up in the details of arguing this or that particular point or in this or that particular debate without, as it were, having a sense, on the one hand, of either the larger picture or, in a way, what might lie behind that picture, what that picture itself might be a representation or an expression of. So I do think it's important to look more broadly and also to look more deeply. And again, it's been a concern and a sort of guiding principle, really, of the Family Education Trust to look at, to draw upon sort of academic research. In particular, academic research that bears on the question of the effects of certain ways of organizing life, the effects of family life and the effects of changes in family life. And again, therefore, I want to take that up today. So I'm going to be engaged with discussing issues from really two perspectives, or at least perhaps I should say from one perspective, which is a broadly philosophical one, but I want to focus really on two different kinds of considerations. One set of considerations are what we might describe as consequential considerations. What are the consequences of certain kinds of social arrangements and so on? But I think we can sometimes be distracted simply by looking at those. I think we also have to look at the internal value or disvalue of certain kind of social arrangements. If you like, we can ask the question, what is this thing good for? But we might also ask ourselves the question, what good lies within it, quite independently of the question of what beneficial effects it produces, or indeed what bad effects it produces. Now, I think again, if I refer back to this characterization of what you're about, there is talk of looking at the empirical evidence and finding in the empirical evidence support for the idea that the traditional family is, and I'll quote the words, associated with certain good outcomes in terms of well-being. Now, of course, philosophers and scientists are very familiar with the idea that associated with could merely be correlated with. But I take it that really what we're interested in is the possibility that these good outcomes are produced by certain things. We're interested about the causal relationship between certain kinds of ways of organizing family life and social life and so on, and the effects that they produce. We could have a lot of empirical evidence that establish certain correlations, but I think we want to go a bit further than that and actually look at causality. We're interested in how it is that family life actually produces certain effects, not as merely correlated with or associated with certain effects. But while looking at that, I also don't want to lose sight of the value that might reside in those family organizations, those family ways of associating and organizing human life themselves. And at this point, let me just quote something that appears in the sort of statement of purposes, I think. It's this. we simply cannot afford to formulate public policy on the assumption that all living relationships are of equal value to society. Now, I don't know how recently that expression was formulated, that way of putting things was formulated, but it certainly resonates with a quite recent way of talking in which people want to say such things as families come in all shapes and sorts, all shapes and sizes, and so on. And I don't know whether this is a response to that, but I certainly think that we need to consider and respond to that claim, the claim that we shouldn't privilege or favour one particular conception of the family, and that's sometimes put informally by saying families come in all shapes and sizes, all sorts and all kinds. Now, my approach is broadly academic, but not from the point of view of social sciences, not from the point of view of empirical research, but from the point of view of philosophy. So I want as well today to try to give some illustration of what philosophy, or at least some aspects of philosophy, might have to offer in discussing and examining, exploring these issues. Sorry, before I continue, I'm just going to check again. Are you hearing me at the back, or have I gone too soft? You're just about hearing me. Good. I once gave a lecture in which the first question at the end was, I didn't hear what you said, could you say it again? And so if that is your question, this would be a good point to ask it rather than to wait till the very end. All right. So as I said, I want to look at what goods flow from certain kinds of family relationships, but I also am interested in what good resides in them. So it's not just good from the family, but it's good in the family. Now, this claim then that is very much current, families come in all shapes and sorts, there's one version of it, is itself an interesting claim. I mean, it's clearly not meant to be simply an empirical claim. It's not meant to be a description of the fact that families come in all such shapes and sorts and so on. In one sense, we knew that, and we've known that for a long time. People who say that sort of thing are not just take themselves to be describing something, they're actually recommending something, or they're reacting against something. And what they see themselves as recommending, and what they see themselves as reacting against, are certain conceptions of how families should be arranged. So they're typically reacting against what they would probably describe as a privileging of the traditional family. So when people say families come in all sorts of, in all shapes and sorts, what they're doing is they're saying, and we shouldn't privilege one particular kind of family arrangement, and so on. And they're reacting against that, often seeing it as oppressive or involving stigmatization of other families. So I want to explore this a bit further. Now, one thing that strikes me straight off as rather interesting is the same sort of people who want to say that we shouldn't stigmatize certain kinds of social relationships, or that we should sort of valorize a diversity of family lifestyles and so on. The same sort of people who say that are often very stringent in their demands when it comes to things like health or social relationships or notions of equality or notions of justice. What I mean is they don't tend to say things with a sort of relaxed air, well, equality comes in all sorts of shapes and sorts, or that health comes in all sorts of shapes or sorts, or environments come in all sorts of shapes and sorts, and so on. It tends to, from the same quarter that produces this remark about families, there tends to be actually a rather sort of puritanical and demanding, strict notion of what counts as a legitimate environment, or what sort of thing counts as legitimate health, and so on. And such people would not dream for a moment of taking a relaxed view about those matters. In fact, on the contrary, they want to use the power of the state to enforce certain ranges of policies with regard to, say, smoking, for example, or regard to the environment, and so on. And I think what lies behind that, and I'm not criticizing them for it, but what lies behind that is a certain normative view, a view not just about as well how people live, but about how people ought to live. So there's a view about what constitutes a healthy life. And the role of government, say such people, is to at least enable and to support, if not to promote, and in a sense almost to constrain people in ways that will ensure that they do lead healthy lives. Or to control industry and other activities in ways to promote and further a certain conception of environmental integrity and so on. So the first thing to notice is that there's a kind of, not a formal inconsistency, but a striking difference between, on the one hand, the claim that families come in all shapes and sizes, as if that was a sort of relaxed attitude to families, and the sort of demands and strictures associated with the promotion of policies elsewhere. Now, of course, you can resolve tensions and inconsistencies in different ways. You can give up one side of the thing, or you can give up the other. And I don't think that the people who would see themselves as part of, this is a phrase that has been rather overworked, we were just talking about it a moment ago, but it's hard to move in Scotland without hearing this expression, but I know it's featuring a lot here. People who would see themselves as part of, quotes, a progressive consensus. I'll say why I find it difficult to hold down my lunch when I utter that expression a little later on. But people who see themselves, I mean, not for reasons of the substance of it, but for the kind of fatuity of it, actually. But at any rate, the people who see themselves as parts or representatives of a progressive consensus around issues like equality, justice, environment, and so on, really don't want to be relativists about these things. They don't want to sort of say, well, you know, there's no truth, there's no falsity, there's nothing that we should favour against anything else. They've got very definite views about what should be favoured. And so what I think that tells us is that really what's going on here is that when people say families come in all sorts of shapes and sorts and so on, they're not taking a relaxed attitude to that matter. In fact, what this is part of is the attempt to substitute one conception of family life for another one. It's not just a question of deprivileging what you might call the traditional family. It's about reprivileging or privileging for the first time certain other conceptions of family life. By the way, just to explain, in case you just think I'm some sort of rabid reactionary, let me explain why my discontent or dissatisfaction with the expression progressive consensus. Let me explain why I voiced that. The way that I was explaining this to students in St Andrews recently, was that if we look at language, what we'll find among descriptive terms are some terms that are really formal terms, or, sorry, this is going to sound like a lecture on the philosophy of language. I'll get it over with very quickly. We get some terms that are sort of formal terms or categorical terms, and then we get terms that have a definite content. So just to illustrate this, the term shape or the term color isn't the name of a shape or the name of a color, right? What it introduces is a broad category. So the term color introduces a set of terms, red, blue, azure, aquamarine, scarlet, and so on. These are real color terms. The term color is not itself a color term. It's, as it were, a name that gets put on a whole set of terms. And the term shape is not the word shape is not the name of a shape, right? It introduces a set of terms, square, rectangular, circular, oval, and so on. Now, progressive is a bit like this, actually. Telling somebody that you're an advocate of a progressive consensus doesn't really tell us anything. Progressive isn't really a substantive term. It doesn't have any real content. After all, as I sometimes point out, somewhat to the discomfort of people who use the expression progressive consensus, it's pretty clear that Hitler in the 1930s saw himself as a progressive. Hitler was very concerned to overthrow certain traditional conceptions which he thought as unnecessarily constraining us, tying us to a past that was a past of a kind of oppression and so on. And so Hitler saw himself as a progressive. Indeed, Mussolini saw himself as a progressive. Stalin saw himself as a progressive. Of course, you're going to think of yourself as a progressive, because what you're trying to do is secure the approbative associations of a term like progressive, moving forward. You know, we're the party that wants to move forward. So the point about talk about progressive sense is it's a kind of, at its weakest, it's a sort of an attempt to secure by non-rational means the victory of an argument by just saying, well, this is the progressive consensus and so on. But at its worst, it's actually a form of verbal bullying. And it's rather interesting, for example, I mean, the part of the world that I come from, or currently come from, Scotland. And by the way, I'm not abandoning Scotland altogether. We'll be spending half the year in Scotland when we go, not when we're in Texas, but when we go to Texas. In Scotland, around the referendum, the independence referendum, and again more recently in Ireland around the same-sex marriage referendum, the term progressive consensus became a bullying term. Right? It was a way of trying to intimidate people by asking them, are you or are you not part of the progressive consensus? Which side are you on? And as I say, the trouble with this is, I mean, apart from the fact there's a certain unpleasantness and bullying quality about it, is that the expression progressive consensus has no determinate content. It doesn't tell you any more than saying, do you favour colours? Yes, yeah, I favour colours. Right. So which colour is it you favour? You know, yes, I favour progressive policies, but what's the content of those policies? So progressive really isn't a very useful term, but it's worse than not being useful. It's really become a cover for a form of social intimidation. It's a way of trying to disable an opponent in an argument by showing in advance, I don't really need to know what you're going to say now, because I know you're a reactionary, you're not part of the progressive consensus. And the trouble is, I think, that many people are intimidated by this. People just are fearful. And it has the consequence that people in public debate, at least in my experience, begin by trying to ingratiate themselves with the opponents, or they begin by apologizing, excuse me, for their own position. They'll say things like, you know, I wouldn't want to be thought to be reactionary. I do respect the progressive consensus, and then, but can I just please have a little square inch here of space in all of this? And that seems to me as a disaster. So the first thing we really need to do is just sort of clear the ground of nonsense. And another kind of nonsense, and this is how we got to this, is the claim that families come in all shapes and sizes, all sorts and kinds, and so on. Well, of course they do. And what was the point of that? The question we want to ask ourselves is not how do we find social arrangements, but how ought social arrangements to be? And of course, the person who says that families come in all sorts and so on is not really just merely describing. They're actually recommending. They're trying to do what somebody does who uses the expression progressive consensus. They're trying to win the argument before it's even been embarked upon. Because if you say, well, yeah, that's true, of course, well, exactly. So why are we privileging the traditional family? So it isn't really a sort of a neutral point. And what I think that results in is this. Let's just set all that talk aside and get on with the serious business of determining what's good for human beings at the level of family life, at the level of social life, and so on. So as I say, imagine somebody saying, you know, notions of health and of environmental integrity come in all shapes and sorts, and we shouldn't privilege one conception over another. Or again, can you imagine somebody from the same quarter saying notions of liberty and of equality and of justice come in all shapes and sorts, and we shouldn't be privileging one over another? Well, of course they wouldn't say that. And they don't mean it in the way that they lead you to suppose they mean it when they say that families come in those sorts of ways. It isn't a description of facts, it's an attempt to try to subvert one kind of claim about how human beings should live in favor of another set of claims. Now, I think that I think we need to just then engage directly. I was going to say the battle of ideas. I actually don't like that way of speaking. Let's just say the discussion or the debate or the conversation or whatever term you prefer around the notion of family life. Now, I think this is going to sound slightly perverse coming from a philosopher, so I'm going to say it and then I'm going to explain it, and it'll turn out not to be perverse, at least I hope it won't. And the thing I want to say to begin with is this, is that ideas are much less important than people think. Ideas are just much less important than people think. There is a conceit, a vanity, that obviously intellectuals, it's hardly surprising, that intellectuals and would-be intellectuals are liable to, which is the belief that history is driven by ideas. And I don't think that's true. At least I don't think it's true in the sense in which they think that would be the case. So to introduce this reflection, let me quote from a great philosopher, the German philosopher Hegel. Now, in his work on the philosophy of right, and the German term for right is nicely ambiguous, more so in a way than the English term for right, between law and moral rightness. So the philosophy of right is the philosophy of right order, as it were, which goes into the sphere of the legal, but also in the sphere of the moral. In his great work on the philosophy of right, in the preface to that, he says something that is memorable. So memorable indeed that I've thought it would be quite nice to have it sort of inscribed on one's gravestone. And it's this. He says, when philosophy paints its grey on grey, then is a form of life grown old, and by means of philosophy it cannot be rejuvenated, but only understood. When philosophy paints its grey on grey, then is a form of life grown old. By means of philosophy it cannot be rejuvenated, but only understood. And then he goes on to say slightly later, not a couple of sentences later, the owl of Minerva takes flight with the falling of the dusk. It's good, isn't it? The owl of Minerva takes flight with the falling of the dusk. Well, what does Hegel mean in that? What he means is that philosophy, as the practice of understanding, if you like, of trying to get a proper understanding of reality, or whether it's social reality or reality more generally, comes at the end of the day. The reality is already, as it were, up and running, and what philosophy does is conceptualize that, give a description of that, a perspicuous representation, an illuminating account of that reality. But arriving at that account takes a long time, and it's based on, as it were, reflection and observation of something that is already ongoing. So by the time really a philosophy of an idea has been formed, the idea has already been in existence for a long time and probably is complete. By that's why he says, when philosophy paints its grey on grey. By the way, there's a wonderful image in that. You have to imagine the philosopher with a sort of this range of paintbrushes down to his sort of one hair, camel hair brush and so on, painting in the details on this painting, little fine details and so on. And there he is completely absorbed in the differentiation between one shade of grey and another, whereas everybody, as far as you're concerned, is just all grey. Right? So when philosophy paints its grey on grey, it's making these minute, very fine tonal distinctions between one thing and another and so on. But actually, as it were, there's a sense in which it makes no difference to the total picture. When philosophy paints its grey and grey, then has a form of life grown old. It's only by the time philosophy gets round to describing it, it's already happened. And by means of philosophy, it can only be understood, it cannot be rejuvenated. Now, the philosopher Roger Scruton, some of you may know of him, Scruton takes this passage in Hegel as really a sort of expression of the lament of the conservative, that really conservatism is nostalgia for lost things. That's his view. I don't take it in that way. Partly I think that Hegel was not saying that ideas play no role in the construction of reality, but the way in which they play that role is through practice. People are moved by ideas, but not philosophical ideas, not articulated philosophical ideas. It's true that by the time the philosopher gets round to describing things, the things have happened. But the things themselves are animated by ideas and by our values. But these ideas and values by which they're animated are not known to their participants in the philosophical mode. They know them intuitively or naturally. So you could think in this respect of the kind of analogy between the sort of thing that an art historian might write about painting and what a painter might themselves know. It's not that where the painter's activity is not informed, but the way in which it's informed is not in the same mode as the kind of description of it that the art critic or the art historian might provide of it. You might say, by the time somebody gets round to describe mannerism or the Renaissance or abstract expressionism and so on, it's already happened. And by means of art history, it cannot be rejuvenated. Right? You can't, as it were, bring abstract expressionism or mannerism or the Baroque and so on back into existence through art history. Art history is an understanding of something, but the thing has already happened. And I think what Hegel is telling us is that if we want to understand the animating force of history, then it lies in human action. And human action is often a response to events. And the real drivers of history have been, and I think will continue to be, things like famine, war, plague, disease, economic collapse, economic ascent, and so on. And this, interestingly, provides a nice point of contact with Marxism, because I think that Marx understood, at least across a range of these phenomena, that the importance of what he would have called the material conditions of culture. And the material conditions of culture, if you like, are just the way that people are living, the way that their lives are shaped by factors that just are ongoing. They may be economic change, they may be climatic change, and so on. They're these sort of forces that shape our lives. Now, I'm mentioning all of this because I think if we want to understand how we've got to the situation with regard to things like the family and what I'm going to just really describe as the attack on the family, the fairly sustained attack on the family that has been ongoing certainly for the last 25 years and probably a bit longer than that. If we want to understand that, I don't think we should look at ideas. I think the ideas that are expressed are often a result of history. I think we should look at the history itself. So let me just remind you very briefly of some of the causes of change, or what I'm proposing are the causes of change. And you know, it's always, of course, once you start going historical, you're also tempted to go back a stage before the stage you're just going to talk about. To understand that bit, you have to go back a bit further. But I'm not going to do that. Otherwise, we'll be back to the Romans. I just want to start out with the First and Second World Wars. I mean, I really think the situation that we're in today, among the most determinative factors shaping the environment that we inhabit today was the First World War. I mean, I really think the First World War was tremendously important because it shattered people's optimism and belief in the possibility of a certain kind of order. It also, of course, you know, took away so many young men who would have been part of building and continuing that order and so on. I mean, the transition from empire in the 19th century into something else in the 20th century would have been very, very different had it not been for the First World War. But the circumstances of the First World War obviously shattered countries like Britain. Remember, people thought it was going to be a very short-lived war. It turned out not to be. Many, many people died. There was a great disillusioning with the ruling classes and so on. The officer class came to be despised rather than being seen as a kind of leadership class and so on. And then nobody believed that after the Treaty of Versailles and so on, that things were resolved. And so we go into that long period of uncertainty, economic uncertainty, the great collapse and so on. And then, you know, really no sooner was that war over than people were fearing the intimations of its continuation. And of course, in a sense, that was already beginning before the Second World War broke out with ventures elsewhere and so on. But the interwar period was a period really of which people didn't have the chance to take their breath and to think again about how to rebuild society. No sooner had they got through this one than the next one hit them. And after the Second World War, what I think people felt was that they were entitled now to, as it were, a break. I mean, for the restraints, the social restraints and the class structures that had shaped things up to that point, really to be removed. And for people to have a chance for some hope of happiness. Now, of course, the other thing that had happened is that through the period of the Second World War, again, you know, many the young men of the country, not only the young men, but the young men of the country who'd gone abroad did not return. And of course, you'd had the experience of foreign forces billeted here in Britain and then, of course, moving across Europe and so on. And so illegitimacy and pregnancy out of sort of very short-lived relationships and so on, hardly call them relationships, became quite a widespread phenomenon across Europe. Talking about continental Europe would be a different talk, so I'm not going to go there, but I just want to say about Britain, I think, and also the encounter, the first living encounter with America, really, I mean, the first face-to-face encounter with America through billeted American troops and so on, opened people to a very different kind of culture and so on. And the result is that just as in the period between the wars, though this restricted to the more affluent classes, a kind of careless partying began. So in the period following the Second World War, there was a sense of it's time to sort of, you know, we've suffered long and hard. It's now time to remove the constraints and for people to find happiness where they can. And I think things like the sexual revolution have to be understood in terms of that. Now, it's true that the intellectuals have their input into this, that whether they're drawing upon Freud and psychoanalysis, or whether they're drawing upon Marx, or whether they're drawing upon Nietzsche and so on, but I really don't think that they were as influential as they thought they were. I think the real shaping influences were from below. It was people's practice. And in fact, the changing practices of people made the reception of those revolutionary ideas much easier. It was because, in a sense, those ideas seemed to describe what people already intuitively knew in their own lives. And of course, if you have gone into a situation in which things have broken down, it's very comforting to be told that that kind of change doesn't constitute disintegration, it constitutes progress. That this is part of, as it were, the forward movement of mankind. So what in other circumstances might have looked like a disaster actually now is celebrated, validated, and valorized as something progressive. And so it's a bit like, somebody who can't hold down their job, who's abusive towards their partner at home, who the children, nobody's looking after the children, they're upstairs just sort of on the internet all the time and such like. And you sort of think, my God, their whole family life is falling to pieces. And somebody comes in and says, no, this is a celebration of diversity, right? Family lives come in all sorts of shapes and sorts. You should celebrate this now. You can see that no longer are we privileging a certain conception of authority. We've removed the authoritarian figure of the parent. We've removed the tyranny of the canon at school and so on. Where now people are actually exploring where they are and things of this sort. And of course, that is a kind of comforting validation or valorization of what otherwise, if you had to face it, you just think was a hell of a mess. Now, there's much more, but I'm not going to... I just will mention a couple of things that I think are relevant to this. Obviously, increasing wealth and the culture of consumerism. But the culture of consumerism extended from, as well, the purchase of what I think they used to call in the sales, maybe they still do, white goods, things like fridges and cookers and things of that sort. The culture of consumerism extended across to aspects of lifestyle choice. And it is very interesting the way in which the language of consumer rights, it's one of those things that's slightly uncomfortable to some people who would see themselves as advocates of progressive opinion, that often the language that they're deploying has its origins in the area of commerce. It's the language of consumer rights. So the introduction, for example, of no-fault divorce is not unconnected with the kind of language that's used whereby if you buy something and it doesn't work, you just take it back or get rid of it or get another one or whatever else it may be. And I do think there's a serious connection here. I mean, I'm not being entirely flippant about this. And again, I want to go back to Hegel. I think it's that, as it were, we became consumerists and then we found the word consumerism. But that practice had already extended beyond the purchase of white goods into the acquisition of partners and the deacquisition, if that's the word, the deacquisition of partners and so on. And it is very striking, for example, in the whole area, not so much of same-sex marriage, but the related issue of adoption and so on, the way in which the language of rights and the rights of people to have a family, for example, have been deployed in this connection. Bizarrely, it seems to me. I mean, first of all, I don't think myself that rights language is terribly helpful in general, but certainly not in this context. But it is a very, very strange, you only have to step back, 6 feet to see the strangeness of the demand of adult human beings that their desire for children be provided for. I mean, it's a bizarre kind of perspective, because it really is like saying, a land fit for heroes, I mean, after the war, in which everybody will have a decent house and so on. Well, this is a new land fit for heroes. Everybody can have children, and the state will provide them, and so on. But it just gets things completely back to front. First of all, it seems to me there is no positive right to have children. Nobody has a right to have children. I mean, you may have a right not to be interfered with in procreation, but that's a liberty right. It's not a claims right. It's a right not to have somebody stopping you do something. It's not a right to have somebody to enable you to do something. But that language didn't begin with gays. It began with heterosexuals around the whole area of reproduction. And again, the sort of rampant consumerism that is sort of extended through all of this. And in some respects, I think the old left were more acute on this matter than the new left, because the new left have just absorbed, because they are themselves symptoms of this kind of rabid consumerism, have sort of appropriated this sort of language. I'm careful that I'm not going to say anything controversial today, so that's all right. Now, alongside that, you get, obviously, the breakdown in class structure, but I'm not so much, here I'm not interested in the old ideas of class structure. We in Scotland, of course, it's not that we don't have classes, but they're slightly less rigid than here. And, but the real the real disaster in the period since the Second World War is not the breakdown of class per se. In fact, I don't think it's a disaster at all, but it's a breakdown of authority. And the medium of authority in British society were not the upper classes. It certainly wasn't the aristocracy. It wasn't even the landed gentry, the nobility, and so on. It was the middle classes. It was the professional middle classes, the doctor, the teacher, the lawyer, and so on. And then the lower middle classes, the reliable tradesman, the person who'd been trading for perhaps 2 or 3 generations, and so on. And these people's lives were structured by a sense of their own practice that saw it as oriented to the goods of community, of having a certain status within their communities. I mean, that's really, in a sense, part of the whole business of, established 1876 and so on. I mean, this desire to try to show that you've been part of this community, that you've been serving generations of people and so on. The absorption into the middle classes of these practices of sort of rampant hedonism, narcissism, and so on, really has disabled them from being any kind of authority figures. And it's another aspect of this, as they say, while I'm on this subject, it's another aspect of this, the very interesting phenomenon, which I'm sure you've talked about in the past, of the advancement of childhood into early adulthood. So the attempt to try to render... So there's a sort of... Nobody has yet quite got around to defining what this profile is, but let us say, it's a bit like, on lavatory doors, there's a picture of a human being, a male and a female, right? And these are sort of stereotypical forms, right? They tend not to show them bent over crouching with a walking stick, right? Or in a pram, right? There's just this sort of idealized form that is the male or the female. Now, we've got a conception of what you might call the human being, which is represented relentlessly through advertising and things of that sort, in which the human being is slim, fit, tall, is probably somewhere between, I don't know, sort of 18 and 35 or something of that sort, right? And so every effort is spent trying to get there, and then having got there, trying to stay there, right? So all this stuff about, 70's the new 50 and sort of 60's the new 40 and all the rest of it, so on, is part of, it seems to me, a kind of rapture of narcissism, right? It's this culture of this ongoing and extended choice-based party, right? In which everybody has their place, everybody can have their place, and it's everybody else's responsibility to respect that. Now, again, just to illustrate how rapidly this has happened, think of how quickly the term toleration has been reinterpreted. So toleration is the primary virtue in context of disagreement or difference. So in a society, obviously, you will have people who have got different views, different values, and so on. And toleration is extremely important because what toleration allows us to do is to live with people with whom we disagree. Right? So toleration is, as it were, put it paradoxically, as it were, putting up with something with which you would not otherwise put up. Right? I mean, it's living with something, accepting something, which in another sense you don't accept. There's not a contradiction there, because what we say accepting means socially being willing to live alongside people whose practices are ones that morally one does not accept, let's say. And wherever, in any given society or of any complexity, there will be disagreements of these kinds, and so it's a mark of maturity and sensibility and so on to be tolerant. Tolerance is a good thing. But notice that over, say 15 years, toleration has actually shifted to become approbation, and approbation has shifted to become celebration. So it was entirely possible to say, and everybody understood what you meant when you said, well, look, I really firmly disagree with this, but of course, I think it must be tolerated. I mean, this kind of diversity is acceptable and so on. Somebody's going to say that. I mean, they just are going to say that isn't toleration. Because, and I think everybody in this room has lived through this phenomenon, that toleration has been recalibrated, shifted, now then to mean approbation, right? You don't tolerate something unless you approve it. This kind of mere toleration is intolerable. But actually, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've gone from approbation to celebration. So it will be, you will show yourself to be intolerant by not celebrating something with which you disagree. Right? Now again, I go back to, the business about progressive consensus, families come in all shapes and sizes. This is just a corruption of language. But the importance of that is, it's not that I'm some sort of linguistic fetishist here. It's rather that if we corrupt our language, we corrupt our thought. And our thought was our best chance to try to work out and to understand important things about human life. And the situation in which we find ourselves, therefore, is one of not mere confusion, but a confusion that we ourselves have produced, and in some cases that is, I think, a deliberate activity on the part of some to confuse us, to disable us, and, as I say, to make people fearful of giving voice to views that they might have about one issue or another. And by the way, what I'm saying just now, you may think that I'm associating it with particular issues. Of course, it has been associated with particular issues, but I'm making perfectly general points. Anybody who's serious about ideas and serious about practice and serious about how they want to live should be interested in the virtue of tolerance. For tolerance, I mean the historic thing. I mean living with people with whose values you disagree, right? Because the question of how should human life be lived is a deep and difficult question, and there will be disagreement about it. So toleration becomes extremely important. Okay, so what are we to do then in these circumstances? Well, just tell me how much longer I've got.
You've got about another 10 minutes.
Oh, that's fine. That's plenty. Yeah, an hour and 10 minutes. That'll be fine. Yeah. It's okay. Don't worry. I'm more than happy to be stopped. Actually, what are we going to do about it? Well, years ago, G.K. Chesterton, I think it was in a work called What's Wrong with the World, but I can't remember, maybe in Orthodoxy or Heretics or something of that sort. But anyway, at one point he said, by the way, I'm not some people in this room are probably great admirers of G.K. Chesterton. I am too, but I'm not what I call a Chesterholic. Chesterholics are people who kind of imbibe Chesterton a little too often, and with inevitable results. They sort of tend to sort of slur their words and fall off the chair and things of that sort. But anyway, I'm not a Chesterholic, but one thing, there are several things he said that I think are very good, but here's one. He said in human affairs, it's the distinctness of human affairs, that we must first find the cure before we can identify the disease. That seems paradoxical, right? You'd think you'd have to find the disease, and you identify the disease, and then you look for the cure. But in human affairs, we must first find the cure before we can identify the disease. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, what he meant was that we have to first of all work out what the right way, as it were, of something's being, what the healthy state or condition is. And then we can try to understand the condition we're actually in. That the notion, if you like, of ill health is parasitic upon the notion of health. Right? That ill health, as it were, is failing to meet the standard of or deviating from the standard of health. So we must really, in a sense, find out what the healthy way of life is before we can understand what's going on and why these things are diseases or these contribute to ill health and so on. Now, having said that, I just want to introduce you to a linguistic phenomenon of great interest, which can seem trivial in the first instance, but I think is very profound. And it's the phenomenon of what are known to linguists as generics. Now, generics are sentences of the form, here's an illustration of a generic, cats have tails. Right? Cats have tails is a generic. So generics take some class term, cats, trees, glasses, whatever else it may be, and then they say something of them. So, trees have leaves, cats have tails, water flows, or water is tasteless, let's say. Now, the thing about these generics is that, of course, they have what seem like counter instances, right? There are leafless trees and there are cats that don't have tails and so on. But the point about these seeming counter instances is that they don't refute the generic. So tailless cats are not evidence of the claim that cats don't have tails, right? It's true cats have tails, even though there are some cats that don't have tails. What does that tell us? Well, what it tells us is that having a tail belongs to what it is to be a cat. And a tailless cat, I'm not talking about Manx cats, whatever they are, right? But a tailless cat is a cat that is in a state of privation with regard to something that cats have, namely tails. Let me just give another example. Human beings are sighted. Well, somebody says, well, that can't be true because I know a man who's blind. Well, blind people are not evidence against the claim that human beings are sighted. The claim that human beings are sighted tells you something about the humankind. And a blind person is therefore in a state of deprivation with regard to some aspect or characteristic of human life, namely being sighted. Being blind, lacking sight, or let's say lacking sight, is not a deprivation in a stone. And it's not a deprivation in certain kinds of insects, no doubt, because it's not part of their form of life that they need to have eyes. But being what human beings are, being sighted is part of the human form of life. So what I think we need to think about is this: what pertains to the human form of life? And the first thing I want to say that this, as I draw to a conclusion, I suppose, is this: human beings have families. Now, of course, not every human being has a family, but it's part of the human form of life to exist in families. That being in families stands to being human, rather like having eyes stands to being human. It's part of what we are. And one grave mistake is to think that the fact that there are people who don't have sight doesn't show that blindness is a disability. It just shows that people come in all sorts of shapes and sorts. Well, of course they do. But lacking sight or lacking the power of speech are for human beings disabilities. And again, of course, it's no accident that's part of the rhetoric that I'm trying to battle against, that the term disability itself has become, as it were, an uncomfortable term. Because people are sort of drawing back from the idea, the very idea of there being such a thing as human nature, around which certain things pertain as goods or evils for human beings. So the first thing I think I want to say about this is that human beings belong in families. It's part of the human form of life. And moreover, it's part of the human form of life that human beings are completed in complementary reciprocal sexual relationships. That, as it were, being male and being female is part of the human form of life. Now, of course, it's true that not everybody shares those sexual attractions. Some people are asexual in the sense of their desires. They are not attracted at all sexually. Some people are attracted sexually to people of the same sex. But those facts are not counter-evidence to the claim that human sexuality is essentially complementary and reciprocal as between male and female. That human beings are completed in relationships, and I don't just mean, as it were, when I say sexual relationships in the broader sense of sexual, are completed in complementary reciprocal relationships. And children are shaped in the context of families that are the product of and continue to be the expression of complementary reciprocal sexual relationships. So what I'm suggesting is that in trying to engage with some of the challenges of the day, what we need to do is get back to the question, if you like, a very basic and very primitive question, which is what are human beings? And have some confidence in these generics. It's the sort of thing that you see in children's coloring books, or just very simple. Now, I mentioned children in this connection. There's something very, very interesting that psychologists have studied in the last 10 years, which is that generics, these sort of claims of that form, are the most primitive and the most stable form of complete utterance. That children form generics by the age of 2 or 3, and they're very stable. So if children, for example, form the generic cats have tails, you can show them lots of cats that don't have tails, and they won't lose their confidence in the claim that cats have tails. That human beings have eyes, that human beings are sighted, and so on. These things are very deeply rooted in our understanding of ourselves, even that very early stage of development of understanding of ourselves. And this brings me to a second point. And now I'm going to draw to a conclusion. I said, following Hegel, that, or interpreted Hegel in a certain way, as suggesting that if we want to try to understand things, really ideas aren't the place to start. Activity, life is the place to start. That ideas recapitulate, they give expression to something, but that thing is already up and running before ideas get to work in the attempt to understand it. But that doesn't mean that those activities, that, if you like, the human form of life, isn't informed. The fact that, as it were, it's not informed by philosophical theories doesn't mean it isn't informed by thought. And here I turn to an idea that I draw from a figure whom I've studied as well as a scholar, but whose work I'm very interested in, Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas introduces in some of his writings the notion of connaturality. And that's the term, but let me explain what it means. Basically, what he says is this: there are two ways of knowing something, or certain kinds of things. There are two ways of knowing something. One is by a sort of outside theoretical study of it, and the other one is by being it. So, for example, if we try to study some feature of living things, let's say it's a feature that we don't ourselves share, we might have great difficulty trying to understand what it would be like to be that sort of creature with that sort of, I don't know, what would it be like to have 1,000 legs? Well, I just really can't get very far with that. So, but I can study 1,000-legged creatures perhaps and get some sort of outside view on that. But if somebody says, what's it like to have 2 legs, right? It's not as if I have to say, I don't know, I'll have to read a book about that and then I'll come back to you, right? We know what it's like to have 2 legs by being 2-legged creatures, right? That, as it were, there's a kind of knowledge we have of the human form of life that we have not by studying it, but by living it. We actually have a great deal of knowledge, much more knowledge than the philosophers and the social scientists and the psychologists have about what it is to be human, simply in virtue of being human. Right? And I think that this is the connaturality. What he means is we know these things by being of that nature. So, for example, you can try to study what bravery involves as a psychologist or as a moral philosopher and so on, but a brave person knows what bravery requires. They may not use the language of bravery, but they know it by being it. One knows what it is to be afraid without having to engage in psychological research. One knows what it is to be afraid by being afraid. And what I'm sort of suggesting is this, that there's 2 things, right? One is that we have to try to combat some of the trends in recent times, which I think are just destructive, both of our understanding of the human form of life and its familial aspect, but also of its practice. In order to combat that, we just have to get back to the question of what is the human form of life, and actually have much greater confidence than I think generally we do have in the knowledge of what the human form of life is, that it's available to anybody who lives it, and be less intimidated by fancy theories and fancy ideas. Often these theories, even theories that have had enormous influence, like Marxism, Freudianism, and so on, are really very late on the scene, right, in terms of human history. Human beings have been managing the business of living as human beings long before, theory got going and produced its books and so on. Now, you might say they didn't manage it very well. That's true. But then that's part of the human form of life. It's part of human nature that we are conflicted in certain ways, that we have these sort of irresolutions. I mean, if I just switch to another sort of ancient author, really, Augustine. Augustine very interestingly writes of 3 things, what he calls the darkness of the intellect, the disturbance of the passions, and the irresolution of the will. And what he means by that is that it's part of our condition, and we know it, that we find it very difficult to understand the things that matter most. We find it very difficult to understand ourselves, in a way. That's the darkness of the intellect. The disturbance of the passions, that we find ourselves driven by appetites that we recognize should not be moving us. Right? Even as we act, we recognize that we smash up our homes, we smash up our families, we smash up other people on the basis of passions that we know are destructive, and yet we struggle to escape them. And then the other thing is that the irresolution of the will, even when we've understood something, even when we've tamed the passions or recognized the influence of the passions, we still exhibit weakness of will. We find it very difficult to do what we know we ought to do. Now, it's part of understanding the human condition, and I would say it's a more secure element of our understanding of the human condition that we recognize those things about ourselves. It didn't need Marx to tell us about that. It didn't need Freud to tell us about that. Every human being of any degree of maturity and experience knows these things about ourselves. And finally, what we know also is that one of the best structures for shaping people and countering these tendencies is the family. The family is something that has arisen out of our animal nature and so on, out of our pack nature, and then developed in various ways, but it's been transformed, civilized, humanized, and so on. But I think that at the core of a great deal of what is facing us just now is a very, very, very dangerous departure from common sense. On that I shall end. Thank you very much indeed.